Oscar and Lucy, an autobiography. Chapter 1. The War Baby. My dad was not in the war, that is, the Second World War. He tended to steer the conversation away when the subject came up. At least, that was what I assumed he was doing. I was very young, but I assumed he was ashamed, and that belief rather coloured my view of the old man. After all, my chums at school all had dads who'd helped conquer the Third Reich. They had been builders of fantastic escape gliders, diggers of tunnels, architects of impossibly daring impersonations. You remember the hero in Rogue Male? I assure you he was modelled on the dads of my chums at school, every one of them. After a while, we three boys got out of the way of asking Dad about the war. Of course, we asked his brother because he'd been in the Navy. Being very little, I managed to confuse this with his being a pirate. Something to do with ships, anyway. Uncle Arthur kept three little boys spellbound with stories of the Atlantic convoys, little knowing that at least one of them had him standing on the poop deck under billowing sails, a telescope to his eye. The eye without the patch, that is. And there was Uncle Ken as well, modest, pacific Uncle Ken. If you got him in the right mood, sitting down with his whisky, he would go on at length about the drive towards Tripoli. He was almost as vague as we were as to the exact location of Tripoli, but it seemed an exciting sort of place, full of sand, perhaps a little like Teignmouth. There's no doubt about it, Dad came off quite badly in all this. He seemed to have escaped the war without deserving to, without even digging a tunnel or strangling a guard. I had a friend at school who showed me how to strangle a guard. He'd been entrusted with this secret by his father. Dad had escaped by the simple device of not being there in the first place, and that would never do. Being ashamed, he must have been ashamed, insidiously infected his three boys. We stopped asking, and he stopped avoiding. It became white space on the family page. Plays on the wireless when I was a boy rarely missed the chance to use the air raid warning siren as a sound effect. You still hear it now and then, a melancholy wail rising slowly out of nothing, then hanging on far too long, like somebody holding their breath. I suppose it was meant to reassure. It was, after all, a sort of confirmation for those listening that this was not for real. But Mother hated the sound. She couldn't bear it. A hatred out of all proportion. The psychologist in me now would say an unreasoning, pathological hatred, except I wasn't a psychologist then. And for years I never even asked myself why she couldn't bear the way that sound went on and on, why she hated that it didn't stop. She would rush from the room covering her ears, or if she had the cat on her knee, grip the arms of the chair and speak far too quietly for her own good, so quietly it frightened us. "Turn it off, Bob," she would say, and he always did. Did I think less of him because of this awful cowardness? Did knowing he was a coward enter my infant mind? Certainly a coward was one thing you couldn't be at my school, and the masters clearly suspected it was a heritable trait. These were hard-bitten, disillusioned men, some of whom hung on to their titles, Major this or Captain that, men who'd finished their war and ended up, for want of anything better, drumming French into little boys. So quite early on, I came to fear that Dad had been a secret conchi. One boy's father had been an acknowledged conchi. He did his best to fake being proud of it, but he was a scuttling, cowardly sort of boy, witness to the unspeakable father, the Conchi, whatever that was. We were never very clear. But the masters knew, particularly they knew. So perhaps I did think less of Dad, and in truth we never got on all that well. Not on account of his failure, even the vicar explained we must forgive that, but for the effect his failure had on me, or at least might have had. Undeserved second-hand opprobrium. What could be worse than that? Which makes it difficult for me, even now, to write these words. I got the old man wrong, completely wrong. Looking back, I see my father had the worst of two worlds. Not called up because his occupation was reserved. He lived feeling guilty about a distant, abstract war, while a real war, all too close, dogged his every day and drove my mother mad. He was drafted or volunteered, it's a distinction he didn't make, to join a relatively suicidal team of electrical engineers in charge of the power station inside a huge ICI factory. His job was to keep the lights blazing in a little part of blackout England. The letters stand for Imperial Chemical Industries, a vast conglomerate, owners among many other things of Nobel explosives. This well-lit factory was filled with high explosive. Now and then Dad would work a night shift, setting off every evening at about 7 with meticulously prepared marmalade sandwiches wrapped in greaseproof paper and a packet of players, to keep the lights burning in a place that manufactured explosives. Not only explosives, the factory also made sulfuric and nitric acid and the chemicals used to make smoke at sea. Unsurprisingly, this well-illuminated sitting duck was bombed pretty well every week. Mostly the bombs missed because the defences discouraged low-altitude flying. Nonetheless, every now and then some outpost or other would disappear, simply vanish, vaporized in a quick fireball, together with the occupants. They were the ones who didn't go home next morning. In fact, they didn't go anywhere. They were so completely gone, there wasn't even anything left to bury. Much of my mother's war was spent wondering whether she would ever see again the man she made the marmalade sandwiches for. The waiting sent her mad. She never recovered. Bit by bit, years later, the true story of my father's war seeped into the lives of we 3 brothers. It was far too late for him to be a hero. Perhaps he should have explained. Perhaps he assumed we knew all the time. Perhaps he forgave us for forgiving him. I'll never know.